Hi, everybody. Hi, Ann. Nice to see you. It says I have an option to bring you on camera, but I think I'll refrain from doing so. I don't want to put you on the spot. Try this, see what this does. There you go. Hi, Kathleen. Good to see you. People are signing on. I was supposed to be on holiday as of Monday, and I promise I'm not breaking my holiday routine, but some unavoidable work responsibilities came up and for this beginning of this week, and it was very important to deal with those. So I've shifted my holiday schedule around to begin, well, after this tonight. But it's a pleasure to be here tonight to lead our weekly Bible study. Tonight we'll be dealing with the 8th of 10 Commandments. And just full disclosure, I will be pre-recording the talk for Commandments 9 and 10. So, hi Irene, hi Courtney, good to see you both. And Shirley, good to see you, and Ian as well. Nice to see you all. So, yeah, well, the last two Commandments, 9 and 10, will be the subsequent Wednesdays coming up, but those will be pre-recorded since I'll be on holiday at that time. So if I look very similar in those videos to what I look like tonight, that's why I'm not that consistent with my wardrobe. So, at least I hope I'm not. So we'll start tonight. Hi, Suzanne. Very good to see you. It's been our custom to read through the text up through the commandment for tonight's consideration. So from the book of Exodus, chapter 20. God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me, or besides me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to the thousandth generation of those who love me and who keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold the one guiltless who takes the name of the Lord in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not commit murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. And that is where we're going up to tonight, the 8th commandment. Do not steal. So just to zoom out for a second and reconsidering the whole intent again and the purpose of these 10 commandments is God's intention in these commandments is to both protect and enhance human freedom, human flourishing. These commandments were given for the benefit of humanity, right? So instead of viewing them as finger-wagging, killjoy commandments, they're meant to help us be as fully human as we can be, as God intends for us to be as human beings, right? And when I was looking over this commandment and preparing for this, I was reminded about what Paul says about the law, and I think the 10 commandments are the heart of the law. What he says in Galatians chapter 3, verse 24, you don't need to look it up if you don't want to, I'll just read it. He says, the law was our guardian or our custodian or our protector until Christ came, in order that we may be justified by faith. That's Galatians 3, verse 24, right? So I like this idea that the law is God's guide to us, that the law itself points us back to God, back to Jesus Christ. The law can be our teacher that leads us to God. If we ever want to know what kind of life God desires for each of us, we can look at the Ten Commandments and get some pretty strong data on that front about how God intends for us to live, right? And it must be said as well that for us as Christians, the intent is not to keep the law under our own power. It's not about proving ourselves, our moral fiber. Instead, the law is meant to drive us back to God, back to our Father, back to the loving arms of God's grace. That's the point and purpose of the law, right? And it's in Jesus Christ that we receive our true forgiveness, not through keeping the law perfectly. Only Christ kept the law perfectly. And so through Christ we receive forgiveness, and through the Spirit we are then given the power to live as the people of God. Right? So, back to the 8th commandment. This 8th commandment, which is very short, it says, "You shall not steal." Now, at first glance, maybe this commandment doesn't seem to be a problem for most, if not all of us. Most of us, if not all of us, are, or at least try to be law-abiding people, and as far as I know, we don't break into the homes of others to steal. Right? Now, perhaps though some of us, in our particular context, have been on the other end of theft. Perhaps some of us have had the experience of being stolen from. Maybe so. I remember when I was at university long, long ago now, in Spokane, Washington, at Whitworth. At one point I saved my money and I bought a new pair of speakers for my car, and they were really impressive speakers, I have to say, with subwoofers, the whole kit, the things that a young man would be interested in, I suppose. And one day I got into my car to, I think, go to my student job, remember, and turned on my car, turned on the music, expecting to hear this loud, wonderful surround sound in my car, and I could only hear my front speakers, nothing coming from the back speakers. So I turned off my car, got out, opened up the boot of the car, and discovered that someone had popped the lock in my car and stolen my new speakers during the night. It felt awful at the time to be stolen from. It felt like a violation, right? So perhaps we've experienced it this way, but I wonder how else can we perhaps learn from this prohibition against theft? Besides the obvious physical acts of stealing or being stolen from, how else does this commandment speak to us today? And I think if we take the time to reflect on it, there is very wide scope for the power of this commandment, for how it can apply to our lives. It's still very relevant for us today. First, we have to understand the meaning of the word that we translate as steal, right? That's first. And second, we have to understand the wider issues which come forth from this commandment. So first things first, the meaning of the word steal, right? So the word steal in the Hebrew is a Hebrew word, ganab, which the meaning of the word in Hebrew has something which sets it apart from other Hebrew words for theft. There are many words for theft. And ganab in Hebrew refers to a kind of thieving with an element of secrecy to it, right? Like not just violent seizure of goods, but a subtle, sneaky taking of what does not belong to us, right? And I'll pause real quick to say hi to my mom who just signed on. Hi, Mom. Good to see you. So ganab has stealing with an element of secrecy, right? And in the Greek, in the New Testament, the Greek is the language of the New Testament, if we didn't know. The Greek word for theft or stealing is klepto, and we get our word kleptomaniac from that. And this klepto also refers to a secretive, sneaky kind of stealing with cunning, stealing with flattery, to do something in a shifty manner, right? And so if that's the kind of theft that this commandment is talking about, perhaps we can still see how this has a lot of meaning for us today. The secret desire to possess and to keep when we shouldn't. I think it's closely related, as we'll see in a couple of weeks, to the 10th commandment, which speaks against coveting, right? And we think back to when it comes to the topic of stealing and what kind of theft is being covered in this commandment, we can think back perhaps to one of the more famous stories in the New Testament, the story of the cleansing of the temple by Jesus. All four Gospels include this account of Jesus cleansing the temple. The Gospel of John puts it earlier in the narrative, but the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, put it near the end after Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem before the time of his crucifixion. Right? And we know the story well, right? It's one of the most famous stories in all the Bible, that Jesus charges into the temple, fashions a type of whip, and overturns the table and drives out the money changers from the temple. And he quotes scripture indicating that those money changers and those merchants in the temple have made his father's house into a den of thieves, right? Thieves, that's a very strong word. He's accusing these people, in other words, in the temple, of breaking this 8th commandment, right? So how can he call them thieves? Aren't they just business people going about their work? What's going on here? And he calls them thieves for several reasons. One, because these merchants and whatnot were charging what could only be called extortionate prices for their goods. They were selling animals for ritual sacrifice within the temple in Jerusalem, right? And the money changers as well were offering very poor exchange rates. So, and to make sense of that, it has to be said that in the time of the Jewish temple and the life and ministry of Jesus, the temple had its own currency, right? So we know that Rome was the occupying power at the time, but people could not use Roman money directly to buy the animals they needed for their ritual sacrifices, that they had to first exchange their Roman monies for temple currency, which could then be used. And that was the rub right there, is that they were given a very bad exchange rate for the temple money that they needed to buy the sacrifice. It was a double whammy of thievery. First, stealing their money by not giving them the proper equivalent, and then overcharging them in the process. So it was really quite an awful thing that was happening, right? And some of us might say, well, that's just how business is done. The business are in the business of making money. But things that we might treat as normal acts of business were labeled as theft by Jesus because they were charging extortionate rates or unfair amounts, right? And it makes me think, what are some of these crafty theft-like acts that we often tolerate in our world, or maybe that we've done ourselves? What would Jesus call these things? And there's a wonderful scholar named Darrell Johnson. I have to give him credit because I don't want to steal his work. And he offers a list of reflecting on following habits that we might brush off as, inconsequential, but still very much speak to the meaning of this commandment. He reflects on actions such as taking office supplies home from work. Now that might seem rather trivial to us, but couldn't we argue that that's a kind of thieving? What about making personal use of work resources while at work, making personal phone calls from a company landline, or using company computers to access non-work content? Now, in certain contexts, that could be considered a type of theft as well. What about taking longer coffee and lunch breaks than those which we are entitled to, feeling like we deserve it? But if that's taking away from the work we are paid to do, isn't that a kind of theft? About making copies of copyrighted material, right? That's a type of intellectual property theft. Parking in handicap spots because it's all that's left and we are really much in need, but it's still taking from someone who may be in need. What about plagiarism, where, if we don't know what plagiarism is, it's citing a source in an academic work and then not giving proper citation credit, right? So passing someone else's work off as our own, that's a type of theft. Another everyday one is, say you're at the co-op or other kind of store and you pay with cash and the cashier gives you too much money back as a mistake, and we decide not to speak up and we keep it. That's a type of theft because somebody at the end of the day is going to have to pay for that, going to have to make up that difference in the till, aren't they? Going to a car dealership and paying more than the vehicle is worth. Again, some would say that's good business, right? But is that ethical? Is that really living within the heart and the intent of God's commandments, to intentionally charge someone more than what something is worth, right? And it's not just with material goods that theft is an issue. What about human behavior like gossip? And I don't know a human being alive who has not gossiped, myself very much included. It's something in our human nature. But gossip can be a type of theft because it's, bear with me here, stealing the goodness of someone's reputation, right? So we can see how this commandment against stealing still has a lot of relevance for our life today, right? We can also recognize the issues which flow from this commandment, lest we get the wrong impression, right? First of all, that we can say from this commandment that the eighth commandment does affirm the reality of property, of privately owned property, personally owned property, things like clothes, shelter, food, and land. Because after all, whenever we speak about stealing from someone, stealing implies ownership, right? So there's nothing inherently wrong with having possessions, but one must be careful at the same breath that one does not declare the absolute right of private property. Only God alone has absolute ownership of anything and everything. The psalmist writes, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof." That's a very poetic way of saying everything really belongs to God, right? So in one very real sense, that means we as Christians can never really claim to truly own anything. All that we have and all that we are belongs to God and is a gift from God, and we must treat it as such, right? So the eighth commandment that speaks against stealing also reminds us, all of us, that we are stewards of the earth. We are protectors of the earth, and we are called to live a lifestyle that shows this reality, that we are always accountable to God for how we use what God has given to us. This commandment against stealing also reminds us that we live interconnected lives with each other. What we do with our stuff, how we live our own lives, has an effect on other people, right? And to put this into a current day controversy, and I'm not going to apologize for being controversial, but the issue of wearing masks in public right now because of the coronavirus pandemic. In a way, we could say that not wearing a mask is an attempt to steal the health of others or to harm the health of others. It's refusing to do such things is trying to refuse the idea that we are connected with each other, that what I do impacts others and vice versa, right? And so the eighth commandment reminds us that we live interconnected lives with each other. We are accountable to each other for how we live and for how we care for each other. So this eighth commandment also warns us about the danger of greed and the seductive power of having stuff, right? And again, from Darrell Johnson, who was one of Heather's teachers and regent, he suggests that the same urge that pushes a thief to actually steal can also push us to cling too tightly to what we have. There's that great story in the Gospels where the rich young man comes to Jesus and says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus, tells him some of the commandments, and he says, "Yes, I've kept these for all my life." And Jesus says, "Well, one thing you lack, go and sell all that you have, give it to the poor, and then come follow me." And the text tells us that the young man went away sad because he had a lot of possessions, that he was holding on so tightly to those things that they kept him from following God with an undivided heart. And we have to acknowledge the fact in the Gospels that Jesus had more to say about money and about land than he did about pretty much any other single topic. Money including talk about poverty and the rich and whatnot. And this commandment, again, the eighth commandment against stealing, finally also reminds us that we have to put our ultimate trust in the Lord as our provider, right? This commandment speaks to our anxiety about the future. In what are we placing our trust? And if we truly trust the Lord with our lives, we do not need to overtly or secretly take from others what is not ours, right? This commandment reminds us that our goal as Christians, contrary to what the world might tell us, our goal is not to be people who of excess. We're not called to be people who have more than we need. We are called rather to be people of enough. I'll say that again. We're not called to be people of excess. We're called to be people of enough. I think the reality is that this world of ours has enough resources for everyone. But we can all admit, I think, that the resources of this world are not divided up in anything resembling an equal fashion, right? But if everyone were to abide by this commandment and to aim for enough instead of excess, we could be shocked at the kind of transition and transformation that would happen in our world, right? And really, this 8th commandment, at the end of the day, calls us back to the 1st commandment, right? To keep no other gods before the Lord. There's freedom in his commandment, freedom to trust, and therefore freedom to give, right? To not be driven by a life of fear, but be driven by a life of faith instead. And I think that's how the 8th commandment, this prohibition against stealing, enhances our quest for human wholeness, freedom, and flourishing. Okay? So hopefully we've seen tonight how many different ways this 8th commandment can speak to our lives, can challenge us, and can convict us how to live differently, to have more regard and care and compassion for others going forward. And my prayer for each of us, myself included, is that we would all be free from such fear, and that we would find our true rest, our true hope in trusting the Lord. We become not people of excess, but people of enough. So thank you all very much for joining tonight. If you're around the area in Kemnay, if you're in need of any help or assistance, even while I'm on holiday, there's other folks, other leaders in the church who are very happy to help. The contact information is listed on the church website, kemnayparish.church. Feel free to check that out. And I look forward to being back live for Bible studies, probably in the autumn sometimes, that will resume hopefully in late August or early September. But we'll have 2 more sessions, pre-recorded first, on Commandment 9 and 10, and I hope those will be enjoyable and of benefit to us in the weeks to come. Thanks all very much. Take care. God bless.